Today, everyone who is enrolled in the course should be receiving the final paper assignment. And next week, I will make some remarks about it and ask if you have any questions after you've had a chance to consider the assignment. Now, we have 5 classes left. In the first of those 5 classes today, I will address the relation of finance to the real economy. In the second class, the relation of labor to capital. The second and third parts of what I described as the productivist project. In the third class, globalization and its relation to national alternatives. In the fourth class, the alternative futures of economics, the theoretical approach to the study of the economy that is now established, and the alternatives to it. And in the fifth class, we'll have open conversation about the themes of the course and the themes of your papers. Now, before I turn to today's central topic of finance and the real economy, let me say something about the general themes of the course as they have emerged so far. And I hope that that brief reminder will be useful to you in the formulation of your final papers. So a first general theme is the theme of the alternative forms of the market order, of the market economy. Above all, institutional alternatives, but given that institutional regimes are necessarily represented in ideas, also the ideological assumptions with which these institutional arrangements are connected. And the crucial premise in my approach, and the point of contention, of contrast to the views that are now dominant, is that I take as a starting point the idea that the market order has no single natural and necessary form. The market order can take very different institutional forms associated with different ideological assumptions. And these variations in the institutional and legal architecture of the market matter not only for their distributive consequences, but also for their implications for the organization of production and exchange. So although this premise that I take as a starting point may seem obvious to some, it is in fact not generally accepted. You could say that it is anchored now in what may be the greatest intellectual achievement of legal theory over the last 150 years. But the overriding tendency of the now dominant economics and its practitioners is to consider that a market is a market, property is property, and contract is contract. In other words, that the market order does have a natural form open to only minor variations. This intellectual premise, which is central to all of the arguments of the course, acquires practical political interest in a particular historical context. And the context is the failure of the last major institutional and ideological settlement, which we sometimes label social democracy, or in its more recent form, social liberalism, and which I want to call institutionally conservative social democracy or social liberalism, this last major institutional and ideological settlement in the advanced societies, hammered out in the middle of the 20th century, before and after the Second World War, is no longer adequate to address the major problems of the contemporary societies. And among those problems are the problems I'm considering in the course as the focus of the productivist project. What does it mean to be a conservative today? It means, in large part, to believe that our interests and identities should be affirmed within the framework of this established settlement, of the received and extant institutions. And what it should mean to be a progressive today is to believe that our interests and identities require us to transgress the boundaries of this institutional settlement. In other words, to give primacy to structural change, but to give primacy to structural change not in the bad old mode of classical European social theory, and especially Marxism. That is, the idea that we take one indivisible system and replace it by another indivisible system, but structural change in the only form that is realistic and available to us, which is its fragmentary form. Structural change is almost always piecemeal, fragmentary, and nevertheless susceptible to being cumulative. And the idea of a total change, a total replacement of one system by another, is hardly more than a fanciful limiting case, rather than a description of structural change as it actually exists in the world. So there begins to emerge in the world a conflict, a contest, which can no longer be understood in the old terms that have dominated ideological controversy up to now. Under those terms, the focus of ideological conflict was the market versus the state. More market, less state, more state, less market, or synthesis of market and state, and that would be social democracy or social liberalism. Social liberalism is the label that describes the contemporary retreat of social democracy in the attempt to reconcile its egalitarian commitments, its commitments to diminish inequality, with the imperatives of economic flexibility. And in that circumstance, the major project of elites on both sides of the Atlantic has been to somehow reconcile American-style economic flexibility with European-style social protection within a barely adjusted version of the inherited institutional arrangements. Now, a central claim animating many of the arguments of the course is that this framework is no longer adequate to resolve the major practical problems of the contemporary societies. One of those problems is the hierarchical segmentation of the production system between vanguards and everyone else, between vanguards and rearguards. And the other themes which are the object of the productivist project, labor and capital, finance, and the real economy. A second theme is the source of social cohesion. From where does social cohesion arise under the terms of this ideological settlement? It cannot arise solely from money transfers orchestrated by the state against the background of ethnic, cultural, and religious homogeneity. this homogeneity is degraded. Its degradation makes patent the inadequacy of money as a social cement. Social cohesion can arise only from the organization of civil society outside the market and outside the state, and from the multiplication of forms of collective action, including forms that make people engage with other people and responsible for other people beyond the boundaries of family selfishness. And a third major problem that is not resolved within this inherited institutional and ideological framework, the framework of institutionally conservative social democracy, is transformation in politics. All the democracies that exist in the world, I've claimed, are weak democracies that continue to make change depend on crisis. And we would need a high-energy democracy, a democracy that elevates the temperature of politics, the level of organized popular engagement, that hastens the pace of politics, resolving impasse quickly, and that combines a facility for decisive central action with radical devolution. In order to increase the structural fecundity of politics, its ability to generate fragmentary structural alternatives outside the enabling circumstance of military or economic trauma. So this theoretical theme that the market order has no single natural and necessary form acquires practical significance in this context, in the context of the struggle over the sequel to institutionally conservative social democracy. And from the standpoint of our concerns here in this course, naturally the focus is on the economic aspects of this struggle, those that have to do with the organization of the market order or its reorganization. So the social democrat will say, what we want is to humanize the existing market order, and the opponent of institutionally conservative social democracy will say, this humanization is not enough. We want to reconstruct the order. Now, of course, the contrast between progressive and conservative is not simply a contrast between acceptance or defiance of this established regime. The contrast also has to do with the horizon of spiritual aspiration. I want to say that the conservative is also the one who thinks that it is natural for human life to be small, or at least natural for it to be small for the great majority of ordinary men and women, except when the terrible crises of war or economic collapse take us out of this long littleness of life. And the progressive is the one who thinks it is unnatural for human life to be small, and we can all ascend to a higher life, a life with greater intensity, with broader scope, with stronger capabilities, provided that we ascend together. And we become greater only if we become greater together. So this is in the background of these debates that we're having about the reconstruction of the market order. Now, the third recurrent theme in the course up to now is then the productivist project, what I call the productivist project, which is the project of reshaping the market order to the end of improving our ability to deal with these central problems that I've underlined, of the relation of the vanguard to the rest or to the rear guard, of the relation of finance to the real economy, to the productive agenda of society, and of the relation of labor to capital, so that free work becomes truly free. And the productivist project then is the project by which the would-be progressives in these societies, under institutionally conservative social democracy, insist on going beyond the limits of the established institutional regime and develop an approach to the supply side of the economy, not just to the demand side as they have up to now. And the content of the approach to the supply side of the economy is then provided by the answers that we give to these three sets of questions. The fourth theme of the course then has to do with what I call growth miracles, and it addresses the relation of such a project to its possible constituencies. So in the rich countries, in the advanced societies, the immediate background is the struggle over what comes after institutionally conservative social democracy or social liberalism. But in the rest of the world, in the developing countries, the immediate context is likely to be the issue of escaping backwardness, of implementing one of these growth miracles and joining the small number of countries that have up to now in the world escaped from relative economic stagnation. And in the last couple of classes before the break, I tried to address the question of these growth miracles from the practical standpoint of their possible bases of support. And viewing them from that angle, I emphasized three elements. I said, in the elites, there must be a tension between the rentiers and the productivists. There must be part of the elite that affirms some form of productivist project, not necessarily the particular one that I'm outlining here, but some approach to the supply side of the economy that establishes the bases for economic growth against the rent seekers. So it's a form of it's a commitment to value creation as opposed to predatory rent seeking. Then among the workers who are headquartered in the capital-intensive parts of the economy, especially conventional industry, there must be the conviction that conventional industry has no future, and that if it is to survive, it must be converted into something else, namely a variant of what I'd call the knowledge economy. But the third element in this progressive coalition capable of sustaining and implementing a growth miracle has to do with what I call the subjective petty bourgeoisie. In most populous countries in the world, the vast majority of people are still poor, if not absolutely poor, then relatively poor, but their horizon of aspiration is to a modest prosperity and independence. And by default, in the absence of other ways of satisfying this aspiration, the dominant form of satisfying it becomes traditional, isolated, retrograde family business. That's what I mean by the subjective petty bourgeoisie. So the task then of the productivists, of the progressive productivists, becomes to establish a link to this majority. The majority in its economic aspirations has by default accepted retrograde family business as its object of ambition, and in its spiritual attitude has tended to materialism, consumerism, and individualism because of the absence of other ways of satisfying its aspiration that would be more magnanimous, ambitious, and solidaristic. So the particular version of the productivist project that I've been outlining and discussing, and will continue to outline and discuss over the next 2 weeks, is intended also to appeal to this subjective petty bourgeoisie, this unrecognized majority in most countries in the world today. By providing them with economic alternatives to the default objects of their aspiration, and with spiritual alternatives as well, if we were to extend the discussion further. So that's how this theme of the growth miracles connects to the other themes of the course. So you'll notice that the two foreground themes are the two ones that are manifest on the surface of the argument are the alternative forms of the market order not having a single natural and necessary form, and then the contours of the productivist project. But the background, the historical background, is either the crisis of social liberalism and social democracy in the rich countries, in the advanced societies, or the need to invent new growth miracles in the developing countries. And those are then the fundamental backgrounds to the surface arguments of the course. So that there is just a way of reminding you of some of the central themes and intellectual ambitions of the argument developed so far. Before I advance, let me stop and ask whether you have comments or questions about that. I'll return to this in different forms later on. Yes?
I'm interested, and I mean, this is something that maybe I should have asked earlier, but that you don't differentiate between social democracy and neoliberalism. And
No, I said, so I call it social liberalism rather than neoliberalism. But let me explain, because of course these terms are all contested and fuzzy at the edges. So social democracy in its historical form, as it initially arose, especially in Europe, in its European home ground, included three major sets of commitments. First of all, the protection for insiders against outsiders, especially insider workers in the organized, stable part of the labor market, to the detriment of workers in the secondary part of the labor market who weren't part of this stable labor force. But it also included defense of small business against big business, and the defense of corporate insiders against outsiders, that is, incumbents in the market for corporate control against challengers or disruptors. So that was the first part of historical social democracy, seen in an unsentimental, realistic way. Second part was a commitment to broker social compacts or social contracts or income policies, as they were called, between big business and organized labor. So it was a way of establishing consensus or convergence about the distribution of the gains and losses of different macroeconomic policies, on the idea that there needed to be consensus for something to stick, for it to be sustainable in the society. And these were deals orchestrated by the government, by the state, between these large organized interests of society. The third element of social democracy was the commitment to a high level of social entitlements, paradoxically financed, as I've remarked, by the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption, especially through the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax or some set of functional equivalents to it. Now, this deal of historical social democracy was seen as being both costly because it imposed onerous economic rigidities on the producers, and unfair because it privileged insiders to the detriment of outsiders, especially in the labor market. So it was then attacked, and a large part of the attack was mounted by what is called neoliberalism. But that was not the primary factor. That was an important factor in the weakening of historical social democracy. The most important factor was the change in the actual regime of production, the mode of production. Conventional industry, for all of the reasons that we've discussed, began to decline, and it was replaced by a new vanguard. Conventional industry survived as a vestige of the earlier vanguard, or as a sidekick to the new vanguard, as a satellite to it under its command, the new vanguard of the knowledge economy, which emerged in an insular form. That was the more powerful reason why social democracy was largely hollowed out. It was eviscerated from within. And that evisceration was associated ideologically with neoliberalism. So one way of formulating these categories, and there's some arbitrary element in this nomenclature, is to say social democracy was attacked by neoliberalism. It was this attack on social democracy, sustained, motivated, supported by a change in the actual regime of production. And then the flexibilized form of social democracy that resulted from this neoliberal attack is what we can call social liberalism, as opposed that social liberalism is then the contemporary form of historical social democracy. Social democracy retreats to its last line of defense. The last line of defense is the maintenance of a high level of social entitlements, paradoxically financed by the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption. I'm sorry that the explanation is a little complicated, but in order not to be excessively simplistic, that's how I would explain this relation between social democracy and neoliberalism. And so then, and in the United States, the equivalent to social democracy is the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, with its focus on economic restabilization and economic security, rather than on economic growth and economic empowerment of the individual worker and citizen. And a similar thing happened. So the New Deal was normalized initially under the Eisenhower presidency, and then a series of Democratic presidents, Carter, Clinton, Obama, in effect, continued this normalization. So that's the American equivalent to social liberalism. And the central claim I'm making here is not about any of those historical conjectures, which I've just tried to summarize. The central claim is that this institutional framework, as it stands on either side of the Atlantic, is not an adequate framework in which to solve or even to address and understand the basic structural problems of the contemporary societies. So we need structural solutions, not just reallocations of resources from one end to another. But we can't imagine those structural solutions in the way in which they used to be imagined, as these systemic transformations, as in Marxist theory. So that we have not just a practical problem, but also a crisis in our understanding of structural change. We, unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we have reason to resist dogmatic formulas, and we therefore confront a problem without historical precedent, which is how to affirm the primacy of structural alternatives without succumbing to a structural dogmatism. One of the implications is that we want political and economic institutions that among their attributes have the attribute of being experimentalist. That is, they facilitate and invite their own revision in the light of experience. Any other questions or remarks about that summary of themes? All right, well, let's then go to today's central subject of finance. And I begin by stating or restating the premise of the conventional approach to finance. Modern finance theory as part of the established economics. The premise is a perfectly competitive capital market allocates resources to their most efficient use. If it fails to do so, it must be because of some localized flaw in competition, including flaws in symmetry of information. Or else a flaw in the localized regulatory response to the localized competitive flaw. And so if there's a flaw in competition, including in symmetry of information, the long-term solution is to correct it, and the short-term solution is to make up for it through some form of regulatory intervention. Now, what this idea excludes is precisely what is now the central point in the argument about finance that I want to develop. What it excludes is the possibility that different ways of shaping the relation of finance to the real economy might either tighten or weaken the link of finance to production, to the productive agenda of society, to the real economy. That's the central point in contention. And that point is a variant, is a species of the general thesis that a market order has no single natural and necessary form. If it has no single and natural necessary form all over, in any part of its governance of economic life, that will also be true of the way in which it governs the relation of finance to the real economy. That's the point. So this idea that if the capital market is perfectly competitive, it allocates resources to their most efficient use, excludes the possibility that we could either weaken or tighten the link between finance and production. Now, before advancing in this argument, let me remind you of the historical example that I gave at the beginning of the course, in the very first class, when I described the way in which the United States, in the early life of the Republic, in the period between independence and the Civil War reshaped the two dominant sectors of the American economy then, agriculture and finance. So Hamilton's developmental project had as one of its most powerful instruments the National Bank of the United States, the first and then the second national bank. It was the instrument of the nascent American entrepreneurial plutocracy, and they used it to organize the public debt, to fund the national government, and to finance the opening up of the country. But it had opponents in the United States, and the opposition to it culminated under the presidency of Andrew Jackson in the dissolution of the Second National Bank of the United States. And as I reminded you in the first class, the Americans then established the most decentralized system of finance at the service of the local producer, not just the local consumer, that had ever existed in the world. When they were doing this, I argued, they were not simply regulating finance. They were reshaping the nature of the capital market and the relation of finance to production. So that's an informal historical example of this claim that the relation of finance to the real economy is not a constant, it's a variable. And institutional change can either tighten or loosen the relation of finance to the real economy. At that time, the Americans tightened it in a particular way. The progressives sacrificed the use of the National Bank, and the National Bank might have been used for progressive purposes, because it was more it was more important to them. They thought it was more important to them now to deny it to the plutocracy than to allow it to themselves. And they had no way of imagining how such a national financial organization could be used for progressive popular purposes. So for more than 100 years, no bank was allowed to operate in more than one state of the Union. It was only at the end of the 19th century that the New York banks informally began to assume the role of national banks. So before going any further with the development of this thesis, let me then distinguish two concepts. So one concept is financial deepening, and the other is financial hypertrophy. What I mean by financial deepening is the tightening of the link between finance and production. Finance being enlisted in the productive agenda of society to a greater degree. And by financial hypertrophy, the bloating of finance, its increase of participation in profits and in the talents of society without a corresponding contribution to output and productivity. And so this concept that the relation of finance to the real economy is a variable rather than a constant, then implies this distinction that I've just cited between financial hypertrophy and financial deepening. Now, should I proceed, or are there questions about that? So now, the next step is to map the territory. So take a contemporary economy, like the American economy today. And there are three distinct worlds in which finance interacts with production. First, there is the world of the small and medium-sized traditional firms, many of them family businesses, largely based, as I've stated in an earlier class, on self-exploitation and family saving. These businesses occasionally do access the banking network, especially the local banks, for credit, for commercial credit. But it's not the primary factor in their financing, which is internally generated. And from the standpoint of the lenders, it's not characteristically the major part of their business. The total volume of consumer credit, credit card debt, and mortgage debt vastly exceeds this lending to small-scale producers in the lending portfolios of the banks, both the small retail banks, the local banks, and the national banks. The second world is the world of the large, mature, successful firms with vast pools of liquid capital. They do access the capital markets, but not as clients buying money, borrowing money. They access it to make financial gains for themselves, for their managers, to organize the buyback of their stock and so forth. They are players in the capital markets rather than lenders in the conventional form. And the vast proportion of the financing of production by these large mature firms takes place within those firms themselves on the basis of retained and reinvested earnings. And the surplus then takes the form of these large pools of liquid capital. So if you can take capital spending as a statistical proxy for the financing of production, and capital spending has typically varied in the United States between 80 to 90% of it based on retained and reinvested earnings. So these firms, these mature firms, promote efficiency-enhancing innovations, but these innovations are typically capital-sparing rather than capital-intensive. And they don't require extensive use of the banking system, and especially they don't require it given the presence of these large pools of liquid capital that these firms have. Then we come to the third world. The third world is the world of the innovative startup firms, the disruptive firms. They are the real needers or users of the banking structure. And what they need especially is venture capital or its equivalents in expansive view of venture capital. And I made before the observation, which I now repeat, that in principle you might think that the most important responsibility of finance in a contemporary market economy is to fund the creation of new assets in new ways. And that would be the distinctive responsibility of venture capital. There are very few countries in the world in which venture capital is well established. The United States is the principal one. 80% of the venture capital in the world takes place in the United States. There are small countries. There's a small country like Israel also has developed venture capital. But even in those countries in which venture capital is most established, like the United States or Israel, it represents a tiny proportion of the activities of the capital markets. And this will lead to the observation of a paradox that I'll come to next. So the relation between finance and production is refracted differently in these three different worlds that I've just described. It's a very different reality. Now I want to come to three enigmas in the face of this reality that I've just outlined. So the first enigma is very simple, and it requires a cultivated naivete to be able to even state it. So the question is, what's the point of all of that money in the banks and in the stock markets, given that the production system is largely self-financed? Internally, it's internally financed or funded on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. What is it for? What is all of that money for? It seems that a large part of it is consumed either in the financing of pure consumption or in trading activity. Now, you could say that the trading activity does make contributions to production. Episodic contributions, for example, in the form of initial public offerings of stock, or oblique contributions by establishing in the market, in the equity market, in the stock market, a benchmark of value against which companies might borrow if they did borrow. But I just claimed before that on the whole they don't borrow. The companies that do borrow commercial credit are either these small companies that are not in the market anyway, or they are the innovative, disruptive companies that need finance in the form of venture capital or its equivalents. So it seems that the saved surplus of society, the unconsumed surplus, which is represented by all of this liquid capital, has a dormant productive potential, which is somehow not being utilized for the purpose of the development of production and of the ascent of productivity. That's the first enigma. And it's probably the most fundamental of the three enigmas that I'm going to state. And it then invites this idea that somehow we ought to be able to exploit this dormant productive potential of capital. Now, the dominant theories of finance theory, contemporary finance theory, in different ways try to endow this situation that I've just described, which is puzzling, with an aura of naturalness and rationality. For example, probably the most influential theory of corporate finance is so-called pecking order theory, which says, in principle, internal finance should be preferred to external finance, and in external finance, in principle, debt should be preferred to equity. And the explanation of this hierarchical ordering of finance is supposedly that the preferred forms are the ones which least impose asymmetries of information or disadvantages of information on investors and lenders. But a common observation immediately puncturing this balloon is that with respect to so-called innovative or entrepreneurial firms, what I've described as the natural order tends to be inverted. So for the entrepreneurial or disruptive firms, it's often said, the preference is exactly the opposite. That in external finance, equity will be preferred to debt, and external finance will be preferred to internal finance on the basis of retained and reinvested earnings. So if the aim of the expansion of production and the ascent of productivity is to increase the proportion of the economy that is dominated by these innovative, disruptive, or entrepreneurial firms, one would expect this order to be inverted, and that inversion would then vivify, it would accentuate the paradox, the enigma that I just described. What's the point of all of that money? Now, the second enigma is that it has to do with a different kind of asymmetry. That in good times, when there is no crisis, finance seems to be relatively indifferent to the real economy. And in bad times, when there is a crisis, the crisis spills over the boundaries of finance and harms real economic activity. So finance is, as it were, largely neutral in good times. It's not making a major contribution to production, but neither is it threatening to it. But then when there is crisis, it does threaten it. So it's either useless or damaging, to accentuate the point. That's the second enigma. Now, of course, economic instability is rooted in finance. I think it's the second major source of economic instability, not the major source. The major source has to be with something that seems to be automatic and fundamental, which is the relation between supply and demand. If there's going to be permanent economic revolution, every expansion of supply should generate an expansion of demand, and every expansion of demand should generate an expansion of supply. So Henry Ford famously said that he liked to pay his workers well so they could buy his cars. But of course, they might use the money to buy someone else's cars or to buy something other than cars. So it's a kind of joke. But what the joke reveals, if it's taken seriously, is that there's no contractual solution to the problem that Ford described, of how we can engineer an automatic correspondence between supply and demand. There's only an institutional solution. Keynes's economics, a partial heresy, which was very influential in 20th century economic thought, dealt with one particular variant of this failure of demand and supply to encourage each other. The variant in which Say's law, that supply generates its own demand, is violated. So there's inadequate demand. The inadequate demand is aggravated by the rigidity of a particular price, which is the price of labor, the wage. And Keynes called the book in which he formulated his theory a general theory, but it's actually not a general theory of economic crisis. It's a theory of one variant of these failures of supply and demand to balance each other. The general theory has yet to be formulated. So I want to say that's the main source of economic instability, these unstable, discontinuous relations between supply and demand. The secondary source is finance. And how does finance become the secondary source of crisis? It becomes the secondary source of crisis for two reasons, among others. One reason is that it operates in an institutional and legal context that it doesn't control. which is controlled by politics under either authoritarian or democratic regimes, and influencing, for example, monetary policy. What will be the mission of the central bank? How will it make credit and money available generally in the economy and so forth? Finance doesn't control that. That comes from above. The financiers try to diminish this susceptibility by having the central bankers come from their own milieu and satisfy their interests and their predispositions. But this is an inherent vulnerability. The second reason was the reason emphasized by Keynes. Liquid capital is singularly susceptible to bear the imprint of our humors. It's easy to dispose of it, to move it, and it therefore suffers the effects of our cycles of fear and greed, of elation and despondency. And its movements then, in a money economy, which is not a barter economy, compromise real economic activity. So that's the background against which we have this asymmetry that I just remarked, that finance is largely indifferent in good times, but then can become destructive in bad times. Now then we come to the third enigma. The third enigma is that the most important responsibility of finance, the creation of new assets in new ways, represented most directly by venture capital, occupies such a small part of financial activity. Why? If it's the most important responsibility, why is it so marginal to the activity of the financial markets? Now, if you were to ask a typical venture capitalist about this, he would protest, and he would say, there's no scarcity of capital, for example, in the United States. What there is a scarcity of good projects. And there's some merit to this protest, but this then shows that this problem of the relation of finance to innovation, to disruption, depends also on the dissemination of the advanced part of production. If the vanguard is quarantined, as I've claimed it was, if it's a set of islands or fringes that exclude the vast majority of workers or firms, then there will be a dearth of good projects. And the financing of these projects, the creation of a generalized form of the funding of innovation, then becomes inseparable from this dissemination of the vanguard. So that's true. But it doesn't entirely dispose of this enigma. So it is true that the most important responsibility of finance is a minute part of the total activity of the financial markets, and that becomes easier to understand in the context in which the vanguard activities of production are quarantined or limited to this fringe. Now, what is the solution to these three enigmas? The solution to these three enigmas is the same solution to all three of them. The solution to all three of them is advanced financial deepening rather than financial hypertrophy. Tighten the link between finance and the productive agenda of society, under the maxim that the best way to make finance less dangerous is to make it more useful. That would be the general maxim, and that's the solution to all three enigmas. There's a dormant productive potential of finance, the first enigma. Seize on that potential. make it useful. Finance is indifferent to the real economy in good times and destructive in bad times. Make it useful in good times. The funding of the production of new assets in new ways is a minute and marginal part of the capital markets. Make it central by combining innovations in finance with the deepening and dissemination of the knowledge economy. It's the same problem. And the same general direction of solution. But how would one do it? So let's distinguish the short term and the long term. We anticipated this discussion at an earlier moment in the course, and I'm now going to repeat it in this more elaborate context. So we would have to have at the beginning a series of negative and positive measures. The negative measures would be to discourage or prohibit forms of financial engineering that have no colorable relation to the expansion of output and the ascent of productivity, the rise of productivity. So, example, the options contracts, derivatives, where they arose in commodity markets, have an undoubted beneficial function, which is to increase liquidity. But in equity markets, where they're now most amply used, have been largely converted from a device of insurance against risk, of hedging, into an instrument of gambling. So it's necessary to be precise. The problem is not the speculative element in finance, financial speculation. Because financial speculation can be useful in the development of information and in the allocation of risk. The problem, to be more precise, is the dissociation of the speculative element in finance from the agenda of production. That's the problem. And not speculation as such. It's not that there's gambling, it's that the gambling is dissociated from production. And so we would want to the degree possible, discourage or prohibit those forms of finance that don't have this contribution, that don't make this contribution to the productive agenda. And then we would have positive initiatives. The positive initiatives would try to take advantage of this dormant productive potential. For example, by multiplying channels between the large amount of capital in the public and private systems of the world and the undone work of venture capital, to create, for example, quasi-public mimicry of the undone work of venture capital, as the Europeans have to some extent attempted to do. So that part of the pension money, and the money in the public and private pension systems of the world, is distributed in alternative portfolios that deal with risk by the traditional form of diversification and are competitively managed and professionally managed. The professionals are remunerated for success. And then we create a quasi-public structure alongside the existing venture capital until the work can be done by the private firms themselves. And the private venture capital can even take over from this quasi-public form. There was in the United States a prefigurement of this in the mortgage market, in the quasi-governmental organizations, the governmentally sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which were responsible for the creation of the mass mortgage market in the United States. That was an example of an institutional invention, a form of organization that was neither entirely public nor entirely private, and used to mobilize finance for a public purpose. So something similar would have to happen with respect to this. So let's say those are the initial steps, negative and positive. Now, if we continued in that direction long into the future, what we would come to eventually would be some kind of rotating capital auction of the kind to which I've alluded at different moments in the course. And so there we come to the thought experiment that I suggested to you before. All the productive assets of society are vested not in the government, but in trusts. And these trusts then auction off the productive assets of society, liquid capital and technology, to the users who can provide the trust with the highest rate of return. And we can imagine this conducted under different time horizons. And this then becomes a different way in which we organize the decentralized access to the productive resources of society. Now, traditional private property would not disappear under such a system, because, as I've argued earlier in the course also, private property has an undoubted benefit. Traditional, absolute, unconditional, unified private property. The benefit is that it allows an entrepreneur to do something that no one else believes in without having to negotiate any consensus or to succeed in lifting any set of vetoes. So we would want that to exist as one of the forms of organization of a decentralized market order. But the question is whether it should be the only form. And under this system, in this thought experiment that I've described, at some point one might even think that the underlying rate of interest charged by society for the use of its productive resources becomes the main form of public finance rather than taxation. So the underlying rate of interest is the is the charge that the users of the productive apparatus pay to the state for the temporary use of the productive resources. So all of this productive asset of technology and capital is being constantly auctioned off to whoever can use it. Now, let me make two observations about this thought experiment. First of all, this is, of course, just the radicalization of an idea beyond any limit that would be feasible in any society that we can imagine now. But what it does is it indicates a direction. And between this ultimate limit of the thought experiment and the modest initiatives that I suggested a moment ago, there's a huge space in which we can imagine any number of intermediate steps or forms. A huge space for invention of mixed public-private forms in which the aim is to increase economic decentralization, limiting the absoluteness of the property right. So again, I recur to an idea advanced in the first class. Take a market order to the highest level of abstraction and generality. At that highest level of abstraction and generality, it has at least two dimensions. One dimension is the absolute level of decentralization, the number of economic agents able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. The other dimension has to do with the absoluteness of the control that each of those agents has over the resources at his command. The implication of the unified property right is that the control is in principle absolute. And not just absolute in scope, but absolute in time, because it can be the object of the hereditary transmission of property. Now, underlying this thought experiment that I just suggested to you is the idea that in fact there is no natural and necessary association between these two dimensions of the abstract idea of the market. The absolute level of decentralization and the absoluteness of the control. In fact, there's a contradiction, because we could say we could increase the level of decentralization by diminishing the absoluteness of the control, by making the power of control partial, conditional, fragmentary, or temporary. And then the same productive resources could be made available to more users in more ways. So, a comment now about this. So I stated the enigmas, and I then described the response. A short-term response and a long-term response. The long-term response is, of course, speculative, but it marks a direction. Now, questions or comments about this? Yes.
I kind of see this vision on working most on the supply side of capital, but I'm still concerned on the demand side of capital regarding the capacity, like to bottom-up request this capital. I mean,
louder, please.
Yeah, my main concern is about the quality of the pipeline, particularly in developing economies, to access this capital in the model that the VC system is currently doing it, because they lack. Just think about these small, medium enterprises, which are the large portion of the economy. They most of the time lack capabilities, skills to access this capital and to use this capital in a productive manner.
Absolutely. So I think, and I agree with you. So I think the if you take this problem of the lifting up of small and medium-sized retrograde firms, which after all, in the great majority of economies in the world, are the main source of jobs and the main source of output. So simply to provide capital is never enough. So if capital is to be provided, it has to be provided together with an uplift of capabilities, cognitive uplift of capacities. This is something that we already learned in the 19th century with respect to agriculture. So when the Americans organized family-scale agriculture with entrepreneurial attributes, it would never have been enough to provide the family farmers just with finance. They had to be provided with everything. The marketing had to be arranged, the agricultural insurance and the crop insurance, agricultural science had to be brought to the farmer through agricultural extension. And in that context then of all of these initiatives, finance is a component. But it's entirely impotent if it's by itself. Now, this is of course also the common experience of venture capitalists. They know that money is not enough and that there has to be this strategic uplift. So I agree with you that there's no doubt about that. I'm not presenting the financial element here as some kind of silver bullet that all by itself could change the situation on the ground. It has to be part of an orchestrated project in which the fundamental element is the elevation of capabilities. Technology, for example, has to be repackaged, reformulated, so that it becomes accessible to those users, which are not just the small and retrograde firms, but the isolated individuals who have lost stable contact with business organizations. Remember, I said those are the ones who, in the disseminated form of a knowledge economy, we would have to transform into technologically equipped artisans. So you could think of all of that as a kind of latter-day equivalent to 19th century agricultural extension. And the lesson is the same. It's precisely the one that you just stated. Yes.
How do you feel that social wealth funds fit into your picture of such a government pension funding certain innovation?
You mean a sovereign wealth fund with
Right,
social
so
uses or what?
Yeah, so in Norway they have the government pension funding. There's a portion of it that funds strictly Norway companies,
Yes.
but it's not necessarily venture as in investing in ideas with, I guess, more risk than in your picture of that kind of fund. So I guess, where do you see
So
that?
I think that's all. I mean, all of these things, all of these isolated institutional inventions, which arose in the 20th century, can be utilized for this purpose. Take your example of Norway. So Norway is very rich. It's a small country with a tiny population. It has this sovereign wealth fund. Now, it could use this fund for transformation. For example, it could conceive of the fund as a venture capitalist, and not just to invest in businesses at home. For example, it could say it will fund every young Norwegian to spend 2 years abroad in some part of the world, in some entrepreneurial or charitable activity, in some social activity, so that they will come home and shake up Norway. So, and the principle is very simple, that just by virtue of being born in a small country, you shouldn't be condemned to live a small life. The whole world can be your theater, and the state can pay for it. So that would be all part of, as it were, the spiritual background to these economic initiatives. Now, I do want to insist on the basic logic of my thought experiment to this extent. There's no predetermined limit to how far we can go in reinventing the market order. So the fundamental question is decentralization. So market fundamentalism, represented, for example, by the doctrines of Hayek, is this idea that I said facetiously at the beginning of the course. Robinson Crusoe trades on his island long enough, he would eventually reproduce the whole system of German private law. So that's the idea that the market has this it's a predetermined package. You open the package, the content is already set. And that's not true. And there's an empirical question of how, Hayek's correct point is that decentralization and experimentalism will always be superior to the imposition of a dogmatic central path from on top. That's the true part. The wrong part is the idea that the decentralized order has a natural form. It doesn't. So those two ideas have to be dissociated. And we have to accept the notion that the organization of experimentalism, of this organized anarchy, which is the most attractive idea of a market order, can take different forms. And which of those forms will work best in what context and to what end is an empirical question. open to experiment. And that leads to a completely different set of debates in society. And so instead of the hydraulic model of ideological controversy, market versus state, the question now is which market, which globalization, which form of democracy? And that's a completely different framework for ideological contest in the world. I think that's the most important point in all of this. And in this long intermediate space between the short-term initiatives that I described and the long-term thought experiment, there's all this middle stuff, and like the sovereign wealth funds, like the governmentally sponsored enterprises, all these different ways in which the powers of the state can be used not to suppress the market, but to help create alternative forms of market order, alternative forms of decentralized experimentalism. Now then there's a rhetorical problem, understand. If I'm debating with someone and I propose a radically different form of the market, the first tendency of my interlocutor will be to protest. But that's an intervention. That's statism. Because in the imagination of that person, the market is the market that he knows. And every other kind of market is then somehow a suppression of the market in favor of the state or of central direction. And that denies, of course, that the existing markets are themselves the creation of the state. They're the products of the law. The unified property right is an invention and an anomaly in the universal history of law. It's not something natural. So this would be the fundamental turn in the nature of these disputes. And the question is how we can find a way to fill up this intermediate space with things that offer an alternative but are within the realm of the feasible, that are actionable now in the context of the contemporary societies. That's the challenge that we would face in the development of this idea. Now, are there further questions or remarks about this? Because I would add one final chapter to this argument about finance. And that's to take the crisis of 2007 and 2008 as a particular context in which to reflect on both the dangers and the potential of finance. So that's just going to be the final step in this argument today. So at the end of the 20th century, in the sequel to Roosevelt's New Deal, the basis of economic growth in the United States became mass consumption. And at the same time, in the same closing decades of the 20th century, the United States was undergoing a radical increase in inequality in all dimensions of national life. And the United States was simply the extreme example of something that was happening generally in the Western societies. How did the Americans and the rest of the world manage to reconcile growth based on mass consumption with this aggravation of inequality? After all, mass consumption presupposes a democratization of purchasing power. So it would seem that inequality is incompatible with a strategy of national growth based on mass consumption. the basic answer was the democratization of credit. So let me then suggest a view of the enabling conditions for the use of finance to democratize credit and sustain this strategy of growth based on consumption. So the most superficial level is the level of the way in which finance was regulated. In the second half of the 20th century, the dominant regulatory strategy with respect to finance became what you could call a strategy of regulatory dualism. The central idea of regulatory dualism is that there are two sectors. There's a thickly regulated sector inhabited by high net worth individuals. A thickly regulated sector of financial institutions used by the general public. And that's the sector that has federally insured deposits and intense regulation. And then there's a thinly regulated sector inhabited by high net worth individuals and financial professionals. That's the strategy of regulatory dualism, which continues to be the dominant approach to the regulation of finance to this day, despite the crisis of 2008. So what happened under this strategy of regulatory dualism? It was foreseeable. All the products and services that were prohibited by regulation in the thickly regulated sector were repackaged, relabeled, and represented in the thinly regulated sector. So the thinly regulated sector was used to circumvent the restraints of the thickly regulated sector. That's the strategy of regulatory dualism. Now, the second level, then, is the democratization of credit. So the Americans created a kind of fake credit democracy rather than a property-owning democracy. So that's the second level. And the democratization of credit is the basic explanation for the apparently impossible solution of reconciling democratization of purchasing power with aggravation of inequality. You can do it through credit. And the democratization of credit was made possible in part by the overvaluation of the housing stock as collateral. So you have then this whole system. Now, the third thing then was, the third level was cheap money. The basic strategy of growth in the United States was implemented not by the national government, but by the central bank, the Federal Reserve. And it consisted in making money cheap and continuing in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis in the form, through the many devices by which money was made available to anyone at almost zero rates. Cheap money. And now we can add a fourth level. The fourth level of this operation was then the structural imbalances in the world economy between the surplus economies and the deficit economies, especially China and the United States. So China exported its trade surplus and its capital surplus. And the Americans were then the objects of this, the favorite objects of this export. They imported the Chinese surpluses as the American deficits. capital deficits and trade deficits. So this exchange between Chinese surpluses and American deficits was the major motor of growth in the world economy before the crisis of 2008. And each of these two countries used the structural imbalances as a way of evading the imperative of structural change. So China, it's widely agreed, would need to replace its focus on export-led growth by a deepening of the internal market. And it's not that it would cease to export, but rather that its export-led growth would be complementary rather than substitutive of its internal deepening. And there's a problem. The problem is that the project of deepening of the internal market in China is unavoidably a conflictual project. It implies major redistribution in China among regions, among sectors, and among classes, and is therefore politically subversive or threatening. And thus the desire to avoid it or to postpone it. On the other hand, the Americans would have to escape from their dependence on cheap money and on the absence of a strategy of economic growth that was based just on the demand side and not on the supply side of the economy, the absence of a productivist project. And their escape took the form of this dependence on their deficits, and which were just the mirror side of the Chinese surpluses. So the structural imbalances in the world economy facilitated this evasion of the productivist imperative in all the major economies of the world, beginning with the United States and with China. Now notice then what happened in the response to the financial crisis. First, a major theme was the re-regulation of finance. And the idea was widely disseminated that the immediate cause of the crisis was a failure adequately to regulate finance. But now look at the major regulatory projects that arose in the wake of the crisis of 2008. What were they? There were 4 projects. One was a move in the direction of return to the division, to the New Deal division between investment banking and commercial banking, between banks engaged in proprietary trading and banks that benefited from federally insured deposits. The Glass-Steagall Act that separated these was not actually reestablished. There was just a move in that direction. The second was the creation of greater authority in the federal government to turn around or liquidate failing banks. It was a technocratic project in the central bank to increase the liquidation and turnaround authority of the federal government. The third regulatory project was the project of the international financial elite, headquartered in the Bank of International Settlements in Basel in Switzerland, to increase the capital adequacy requirements of the banks. And the fourth project was consumer protection, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau established in the United States. Now, if you look at those 4 projects, here's what's remarkable. None of them did anything to promote financial deepening and to prevent financial hypertrophy. None of them tightened the link between finance and the real economy, which was the real underlying problem. And in fact, none of them even disturbed the strategy of regulatory dualism. The distinction between the thickly and the thinly regulated sector, with the same justification of paternalism, the high net worth individuals and the financial professionals don't need to benefit from this protective regulation. They can take care of themselves. When that in fact facilitated this circumvention, which I described before. All of that remained in place. The stimulus, so the other major response was the stimulus. And the stimulus was used just to bail out the banks and the financiers, not the lenders, not the general population. There's no reason why the stimulus couldn't have been designed to prefigure a productivist project, to go in the direction of a productivist project. So both the regulatory response and the stimulus response could have been the first chapters or the first moves in a productivist project, but they weren't. And the progressives in the United States have not developed a productivist project. And the idea of a productive project is not part of the debate. It has no intellectual presence in this circumstance. So that's all I wanted to say. And now I ask for your comments. Yes.
Well, I guess just to push back a little bit on those things that that addressed the '08 crisis. Some of those things seem to at least, maybe not went as far as we would have hoped, but for example, I think it was the Volcker rule, right, in terms of separating the investment banks and the commercial banks. Wasn't there some degree of perhaps, trying to get rid of those dualism of regulations between, the population and the elites? I could also, perhaps add, the Basel rules in there as perhaps hopefully trying to put some sort of strangle on or some hold of, this financial engineering.
Well, you have to look at the details. So like the Dodd-Frank Act in the United States. I don't think it really did any of this. So if you examine the legal details, they didn't abolish the strategy of regulatory dualism. So there's a fundamental problem. What is it's a simple question. What's the answer to this question? What is the growth strategy of the United States? So the national government doesn't have a growth strategy, apparently. And it goes even to details. For example, when we talk about infrastructure investment in the United States. In the New Deal, and even in Eisenhower's presidency, infrastructure was related to the configuration of the economy. For example, the Eisenhower administration promoted the construction of a national road network in the United States. That was intimately related to the development of the automotive industry. So there was a productivist logic to it. Now infrastructure investment is on the agenda because the bridges are falling apart. But it's not related to any particular productivist idea. The strategy of regulatory dualism has not been swept aside. And so far as one can tell, the basic growth strategy of the United States remains cheap money. There's no productivist project. So the crisis of 2008 would have been a huge opportunity, but the opportunity appears to have been squandered. And in part because of the lack of ideas. So I think that part of the complication of this debate, which the question back there raised, is that it's obviously the case that initiatives with respect to finance, all by themselves, mean almost nothing. What they mean is when they're combined with these other things. But if these other things exist, then they become vital. And So to engage in this transformation in the treatment of finance, one has to imagine already that there is this productivist horizon. Otherwise, they don't make sense. But if there is a productivist horizon, then not only do they make sense, but they're indispensable. So I think that programmatically, maybe the most important element in this discussion is the element that is contained or concealed in the thought experiment. Thought experiment is that the market order has no self-explanatory form. The genius of the idea of the market is an organized anarchy. But what form should it take? And so you could take this view that instead of fastening the market order to a single dogmatic version of itself, which is the system of private law, of traditional property and contract law, you can imagine that different regimes of private contract and property coexist experimentally within the same market order. And then we find out what works. We compare. And that's a completely different approach to the problem. And the thought experiment is this notion that we'll have, that rather than providing capital to the state or to private owners in perpetuity, we say the assets belong to no one. That's why I called it, half facetiously earlier, capitalism without capitalists. Because the whole idea of capitalism depends on this association of decentralization with absolute control, with absolute and perpetual control. And the contrary idea is the idea that in principle the assets should be used by whoever can use them to greatest effect. The greatest effect for everyone. Make a profit out of them, make a gain out of them for themselves, but above all benefit society. Now, I understand that between that abstraction and the intractable problems of a real social and economic order, there's a huge distance, which then has to be filled up by concrete institutional arrangements. But that opens a different space for imagination. I don't require an immediate response, and you'll have 6 weeks to write this paper. And let me just say, by the way, that anticipating some of what I would say next week about the papers. So these are not research papers. You can obviously cite any sources you want. They're responses. They're active responses to the argument. And what matters is, so I've tried to present a forceful argument in a particular direction, as forceful as I can make it. I want you then to respond and to develop your own voice, your own position in that response, criticizing both method and substance, but above all, going in a particular direction. And you're free to discuss the papers with one another as much as you want, to show one another drafts, to comment on them if you like, or anyone else who's not in the course. The only restraint on that is that in the end you'll be able to say in good faith that the final product is largely the expression of your own mind. So you will notice in the assignment that I sent you that there's a minimum size of 15 pages, but there's no maximum size, because I've learned from experience in these things that some of the most interesting papers are very long. Someone decides to do something which is completely uncalled for and devote enormous amount of time to it. So I will read every single page, and some of those papers have been among the very best papers. So there's no reason to prohibit that. These are subjects of enormous difficulty, and it's very hard to have a debate about these things in the world, because to have this kind of debate that I would like to have, you have to be both a technician and a visionary. And where does that exist? So I'm not saying it's easy, but I recommend it to you. So we'll reconvene next week.